Life has a peculiar way of teaching us lessons about standing our ground, often through the most unexpected encounters. I never imagined I'd become the neighborhood's unwitting champion against entitled behavior, but that's exactly what happened when Linda Harrison moved onto Maple Grove Drive. Looking back now, I can trace how a simple property dispute transformed into a catalyst for community change. All because one person decided my fence offended her sense of entitlement. The whole saga taught me something profound about the nature of community and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to give in. But to understand how things got so out of hand, you need to know about our neighborhood, about my own history here, and about how one person's sense of entitlement can ripple through an entire community like a stone thrown into a once peaceful pond. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of justice served, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Before Sarah passed away, we'd spent 15 wonderful years in this house together, turning it from a simple residential property into something truly special. We'd moved here right after our wedding, when the market was down and we could barely afford the down payment. The house needed work, a lot of work, but we saw its potential. Every weekend for those first few years was spent on some kind of improvement project. Refinishing hardwood floors, updating the kitchen, repairing window frames. Sarah had an eye for detail and a vision for what our home could become. She's the one who insisted on the sage green exterior paint, saying it would make the house feel like it was emerging from a forest. She was right, of course. She usually was about these things. I should tell you about our home as it stands today. It's a 1940s craftsman-style house on a corner lot, painted a warm sage green with crisp white trim that my late wife chose 15 years ago. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had installed a beautiful cedar fence around the property, not one of those imposing privacy walls, but a tasteful 5-foot barrier that complemented the house's architectural character. Over the years, I'd maintained it meticulously, replacing boards when needed and refreshing the sealant every spring. The fence enclosed what I gradually transformed into my own piece of paradise. Curved garden beds bursting with native perennials, a small koi pond that had become a neighborhood attraction for young families, and a vegetable garden that supplied half the street with tomatoes each summer. My neighbors used to joke that I should charge admission for what they called the Morgan Botanical Gardens. I'd wave off their compliments, but truthfully, this garden had become my therapy after losing Sarah to cancer 5 years ago. Every plant, every carefully placed stone, every bubbling feature in the pond represented hours of healing work. The garden wasn't just my hobby. It was my way of keeping Sarah's memory alive while creating something beautiful for our community. The trouble started on a crisp September morning in 2023. I was out deadheading the late summer black-eyed Susans when I first noticed her, Linda Harrison, though at this point, she was just another new face in the neighborhood. She stood in her driveway 2 doors down, a woman in her mid-50s with expensive highlights and what I'd come to recognize as her signature pose. Arms crossed, designer sunglasses perched on her head, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Even from a distance, I could feel her scrutinizing every detail of my property. Being the friendly sort, Sarah always said I never met a stranger. I straightened up, pulled off my gardening gloves, and walked toward her with my best welcome to the neighborhood smile. "Good morning.
I'm James Morgan.
Welcome to Maple Grove." Linda's response was a slight nod and a thin-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Interesting choice of plants you have there," she said, her tone suggesting she'd found something distasteful in her coffee. "You know, when I lived here 20 years ago, all the yards had proper grass lawns. The neighborhood had standards then." I kept my smile in place, though it took some effort. "Well, times change. These native plants are better for the environment, and they attract all sorts of beautiful butterflies and birds. Would you like a tour of the garden? I could share some cuttings if you're interested in starting your own." "What I'm interested in," she cut me off, "is why there's a fence blocking the path to the shopping center. That path has been used by residents for decades. It's practically a public right-of-way at this point." I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. "The fence? It's been here since before I bought the place 12 years ago. The Hendersons installed it in the early 2000s, I believe. But the shopping center's just around the corner. It's maybe a 3-minute walk using the sidewalk." Linda's face hardened. a transformation that reminded me of watching ice form over a pond. "I lived here when the Hendersons put up that monstrosity," she said, her voice taking on a righteous tone that I'd come to recognize as her prelude to confrontation. "Nobody wanted it then, and it's even more inconvenient now. Do you know how many people complained? The Hendersons were always difficult people. They never understood the concept of community spirit. And now you're continuing their legacy of selfishness. Some of us have health issues that make walking the long way difficult. Have you considered the needs of your elderly neighbors? Or are you too wrapped up in your little garden paradise to think about anyone else?" The accusation stung more than I cared to admit. Sarah and I had always prided ourselves on being good neighbors. We'd hosted countless garden parties, organized neighborhood watch meetings, and started the annual spring festival that still brings our community together. After Sarah's passing, maintaining those connections became even more important to me. The garden wasn't just my private refuge, it was a gathering place, a source of beauty and peace for anyone who wanted to enjoy it. I thought about Mrs. Chun, who stopped by every Wednesday with homemade dumplings, claiming she had made too many but really checking to make sure I was eating properly. About Tom's kids, who earned their allowance helping me weed the flower beds and learning the names of native plants. About Maria from across the street, who painted watercolors of my roses and had even sold a few at local art fairs. These were the people who made our neighborhood special, who understood that community meant supporting each other, not demanding special privileges. The irony of her complaint wasn't lost on me. Mrs. Chun, who was actually elderly and used a walker, had never complained about the fence and regularly made the trip around to the shopping center. In fact, she often stopped to rest on the bench I'd placed near my front garden specifically for neighbors who might need a break. "I understand your concern," I said carefully, "but this is private property. If you're interested in establishing a public access path, you'd need to take that up with the City Planning Commission. I'd be happy to provide you with their contact information." Linda's expression shifted from disapproval to something harder. "We'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel and clicking back to her house in her impractical shoes. I stood there for a moment, garden shears still in hand, with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. Something about her tone, the set of her shoulders, the barely veiled hostility in her eyes, it all suggested this wasn't the end of the conversation. I dealt with difficult neighbors before, but something told me Linda Harrison was going to be in a category all her own. I wish I could say I was wrong about that premonition. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing small changes in my garden. Freshly planted annuals would be crushed, as if someone had deliberately stepped on them. The solar lights along the garden path kept getting knocked over. At first, I thought it might be animals. We had our share of raccoons and the occasional deer. But the damage seemed too targeted, too deliberate. Then one evening, as I was reviewing footage from the security cameras I'd installed after Sarah's passing, she'd always been the more security conscious of us, I saw it. Linda in her designer workout gear, deliberately pushing through a loose board in my fence, cutting across my yard, and taking what appeared to be vindictive pleasure in stepping on my plants. The timestamp showed 7:15 a.m., presumably on her way to the shopping center's coffee shop. Over the next several evenings, I meticulously reviewed weeks of footage, my heart sinking with each new revelation. This wasn't just occasional trespassing. It was a calculated campaign of passive-aggressive destruction. Linda had been making this trek at least twice a day, sometimes more, always through my yard, always with the same deliberate disregard for my garden. The footage showed her gradually working that fence board looser over time until she could slip through without much effort. But what truly disturbed me was the pattern that emerged. She seemed to take particular pleasure in destroying the flower varieties that Sarah had loved most, the purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and especially the peace roses that I'd planted in Sarah's memory. Each morning, she'd pause just long enough to step on young shoots or break off blooms, her face wearing an expression of smug satisfaction that made my blood boil. The timestamps told their own story. 7:15 a.m. for her morning coffee run, 2:30 p.m. for what appeared to be shopping trips and occasional evening crossings that coincided with the shopping center's restaurant hours. She was consistent, I'll give her that. The footage also revealed something else. She wasn't alone in her vendetta against my garden. Twice I spotted her teenage son following the same path, though he seemed more interested in creating shortcuts than causing damage. Like mother, like son, I supposed, though the boy at least had the decency to look guilty when he thought he might be spotted. What made it worse was watching other neighbors' reactions to her behavior. The camera caught several instances of people noticing her trespassing but turning away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to confront her. I recognized that response. It was the same way people had reacted to neighborhood bullies when I was a guidance counselor, choosing avoidance over confrontation. But I'd learned long ago that avoiding conflict often only emboldens those who thrive on causing it. My first instinct was to confront her directly, but 23 years of dealing with difficult situations as a high school guidance counselor had taught me the value of documentation and proper channels. I'd seen too many cases of bullying escalate because of hasty confrontations, watched too many well-meaning people lose ground because they didn't build their case properly. The skills I developed helping teenagers navigate conflict were about to prove invaluable in dealing with an adult who seemed to have never outgrown teenage tactics. I began keeping a detailed log of every incident, complete with timestamps and saved footage. My dining room table, which hadn't seen such intensive use since Sarah and I used to grade papers there, she'd been an English teacher at the same high school, became command central for Operation Linda. I took photographs of the damage to my garden and the increasingly compromised fence board, carefully documenting each crushed plant, broken stem, and trampled flower bed. The methodical process reminded me of helping students build cases against cyberbullying, evidence gathering as a form of empowerment. I even installed additional cameras to ensure I had multiple angles of any future incidents. Tom, my next-door neighbor and a retired security consultant, helped me position them optimally. "You know," he said as we were mounting the final camera, "I've been dealing with my own Linda problems." She reported my grandson's lemonade stand to the health department last month, called it an unlicensed food service operation. The kids ate, for heaven's sake. It was stories like these that convinced me this wasn't just about my fence or my garden. Linda represented a deeper threat to our community's way of life, to the informal bonds of trust and mutual support that made our neighborhood special. Sarah had always said that communities are like gardens. They need tending, protection, and occasional pruning of harmful elements to thrive. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I sent her a certified letter. The content was polite but firm, channeling my years of experience writing disciplinary reports that needed to be both clear and legally defensible. I acknowledged that while I understood her desire for a shorter route to the shopping center, her current actions constituted trespassing and vandalism. I detailed each documented incident with clinical precision, included an itemized estimate for the damage to my plants, $340 for replacements and labor, and attached selected still images from the security footage. The letter concluded with a clear warning that I had video evidence of her actions and would be forced to take legal action if the behavior continued. I also included a pamphlet about the local senior transportation service that provided free rides to the shopping center for those with mobility issues, a resource I knew about from helping Mrs. Chun set up her weekly grocery runs. If Linda truly had mobility concerns, there were legal and considerate ways to address them. What I didn't include in the letter was my growing suspicion that Linda's campaign against my fence was about something deeper than convenience. Through conversations with other neighbors, I'd begun piecing together a picture of someone desperate to reclaim a past that no longer existed. She'd lived in the neighborhood during what she saw as its golden age, before the shopping center expanded, before the demographic shifts that had brought wonderful diversity to our community, before the younger families with their children and their different ideas about property use and community spaces. The Linda who'd lived here 20 years ago had apparently been a social queen bee, hosting exclusive garden parties and heading the HOA with an iron fist. Her return, likely prompted by her recent divorce, according to neighborhood gossip, had revealed a changed world that she seemed determined to bend back to her will. My fence and my garden's popularity with neighbors she might once have snubbed represented everything she resented about these changes. The letter was delivered on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, I was awakened by the sound of shattering wood. Racing downstairs in my robe and slippers, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and disbelief, I made it to my front window just in time to witness what would become the neighborhood's most talked about incident since the great Halloween decoration debate of 2019. There stood Linda Harrison, dressed in what appeared to be brand new Lululemon athleisure wear, taking a final triumphant swing at my fence with what I later learned was a $200 sledgehammer she'd specially ordered for this purpose. The premeditation of it all was staggering. She'd even coordinated her outfit for what she clearly expected to be her moment of victory. She'd created a 3-foot-wide gap in the cedar boards, effectively making her own gateway. The morning sun caught the sweat on her face and the satisfied smile that curved her lips as she surveyed her handiwork. As I watched in stunned disbelief, she calmly pulled a small hand broom and dustpan from her designer tote bag, a Gucci number that probably cost more than all my garden tools combined, and began sweeping up the debris with the air of someone tidying up after a successful home improvement project. The absurdity of the moment struck me then. Here was a woman who just committed deliberate property destruction, wearing luxury workout gear and cleaning up after herself as if vandalism was just another part of her morning routine. It was the kind of scene that would have been comedic if it weren't so infuriating. The early morning light cast long shadows through the destruction, highlighting the jagged edges of splintered wood that had stood intact for over 2 decades. I was already dialing 911 when she noticed me in the window. Instead of running or showing any sign of shame, she gave me a smug wave and continued her cleanup operation. Her message was clear. She believed she was entirely within her rights to destroy my property. The police arrived within minutes, a response time that I later learned was due to both the property damage report and Officer Sarah Chen's recognition of my address from previous complaints about Linda's behavior. It turned out I wasn't the first neighbor to require police intervention, though I'd soon become the catalyst for the most significant one. Officer Chen, a compact woman with an air of seasoned authority, took one look at the scene and radioed for backup. She'd been with our precinct for 15 years, and had a reputation for handling community disputes with a perfect blend of empathy and firmness. I'd met her several times at neighborhood watch meetings, where she'd always emphasized the importance of documentation and community solidarity in dealing with problematic residents. "Mr. Morgan," she said, nodding to me while taking in the destruction, "I see our discussion about security cameras paid off." She gestured to her partner to begin photographing the scene while she approached Linda, who had moved on from sweeping to actually measuring the gap she'd created, as if planning some sort of home improvement project rather than documenting her own crime. Linda, far from being intimidated, launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about disability rights, historical easements, and community access. She pulled out a folder from her tote bag. She'd actually brought documentation to justify her vandalism, and began citing legal precedents about prescriptive easements and adverse possession. She'd clearly done her homework, peppering her argument with legal terms that sounded impressive but, as Officer Chen and I would later learn, had absolutely no bearing on the actual situation. According to Watson v. Henderson County 1987, Linda declared, reading from her notes with the confidence of someone who'd practiced in front of a mirror, "Continuous use of a pathway for over 20 years establishes a prescriptive easement. This path has been used by residents since before the Hendersons installed their illegal fence. Furthermore, under the Americans with Disabilities Act—" "Ma'am," Officer Chen interrupted, her tone carrying the weight of someone who'd heard every possible justification for bad behavior. "Regardless of any historical use or perceived right-of-way, you've just committed criminal vandalism. We have a witness, evidence of premeditation since you brought tools, and—" She glanced at my house, deliberately catching Linda's eye. "I'm assuming those security cameras Mr. Morgan installed after your previous incidents are still functional?" I nodded, already pulling up the footage on my phone. The morning light was perfect. You could clearly see Linda arriving at 6:45 a.m., unloading her sledgehammer from a rolling gym bag, and methodically destroying my fence. The camera even caught her doing a practice swing or two, like a golfer lining up a shot. Linda's face went from confident to concerned as she realized her careful cleanup wasn't going to erase the evidence of her actions. More patrol cars arrived, lights flashing in the early morning sun. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. I spotted Mrs. Chen in her morning Tai Chi outfit, Tom still in his bathrobe, and Maria hurriedly sketching the scene in her ever-present notebook. This would probably show up in her next art exhibition. When Officer Chen began reading Linda her rights, the facade of sophisticated legal scholar crumbled completely. Linda's transformation from composed crusader for community rights to indignant socialite was as dramatic as it was revealing. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, her designer yoga pants and coordinated top somehow making the tantrum seem even more absurd. "I have every right to access that shopping center. This fence is discriminatory. Do you know who my husband is? He's a partner at Harrison Mills in Bradley. We handled the Wilson property case last year. This is exactly the same situation." Officer Chun remained admirably professional, though I caught the slight twitch of her lips that suggested she was suppressing a smile. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise it. Your husband's firm can explain the differences between prescriptive easements and criminal vandalism when you contact them." As Linda was being escorted to the patrol car, alternating between threats of lawsuits and demands to speak to the police chief, my next-door neighbor Tom appeared at my side with 2 steaming cups of his famous French press coffee. He handed me one and shook his head, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. "Been wondering when she'd do something like this," he said, taking a sip from his world's best grandpa mug. "She's been making everyone's life miserable since she moved in. Did you know she tried to get the HOA to ban Steve's pride flag? Called it visually disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. And she filed a complaint about Maria's kids playing basketball in their own driveway. Said the bouncing was causing structural damage to her foundation. 3 houses away." I hadn't known about these specific incidents, but I wasn't surprised. Tom, a retired structural engineer, had actually volunteered to inspect Maria's driveway and write a report confirming that basketball bouncing couldn't possibly affect Linda's foundation. It was typical of our neighborhood, people looking out for each other, using their skills to help neighbors in need. I hadn't known, but I wasn't surprised. Over the next few hours, as police documented the scene and neighbors gathered to offer support and information, a picture emerged of Linda's brief but tumultuous tenure in our neighborhood. The crowd on my lawn had evolved into an impromptu community meeting, with neighbors sharing stories I'd never heard before. It was like watching puzzle pieces fall into place, each revelation adding to our understanding of the woman who'd been terrorizing our community. Maria, still sketching in her notebook, told us about the time Linda had called the city's code enforcement about her unauthorized art studio, which was actually just Maria teaching her daughter and 2 friends to paint in their sunroom. Steve, our resident IT specialist, described how Linda had tried to get him removed from the HOA board after he installed solar panels on his roof, claiming they created dangerous glare that threatened driver safety. Even quiet Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his house since losing his wife last year, came over to share how Linda had complained about his bird feeders attracting vermin to the neighborhood. "She tried to have my grandson's therapy dog removed," Mrs. Chen added, her usual gentle demeanor hardened by indignation. "Claimed it was an unauthorized pet under HOA guidelines. The dog helps him with his autism. We had all the proper documentation, but she kept filing complaints, taking pictures of them on their walks. Poor Tommy was afraid to go outside for weeks." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity that revealed just how deep Linda's sense of entitlement ran. I hired Patricia Gonzalez, a property lawyer recommended by my brother, who turned out to be worth every penny. Patricia was a force of nature in a pantsuit, a former civil rights attorney who now specialized in property disputes and had a particular distaste for HOA overreach and neighborhood bullying. "Your case is just the tip of the iceberg," Patricia told me during our first meeting, spreading out a stack of documents across her desk. "I've been getting calls about Mrs. Harrison for months. She's filed 17 HOA complaints in 3 months, threatened 4 lawsuits, and tried to get the city council to revoke permits for everything from home businesses to garden structures. She's not just a difficult neighbor, she's a one-woman campaign against community autonomy." Patricia helped me file for a restraining order and began building a civil case against Linda. The criminal charges for vandalism would be handled separately by the district attorney's office, but Patricia worked closely with them to ensure all aspects of Linda's behavior were properly documented. She even brought in a forensic accountant to calculate the total damage Linda had caused throughout the neighborhood, not just to my property, but to others who had suffered financial losses due to her actions. Linda's husband's law firm, it turned out, wanted nothing to do with the case. Mr. Harrison, a tall, distinguished man with tired eyes and an expensive suit, appeared at my door one evening, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "I want to apologize for my wife's behavior," he said, shifting his weight like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "The firm is prepared to cover all damages and legal fees if we can resolve this quietly." He explained that Linda's behavior had become increasingly erratic since their separation 6 months ago. Their move back to the neighborhood had been her idea, an attempt to recapture what she saw as her glory days when she'd been the queen of the local social scene. "She can't accept that things have changed," he said, running a hand through his graying hair. "The neighborhood, our marriage, society itself. She's trying to force everything back to how it was 20 years ago, and it's not working." But by this point, it wasn't just about the money or the fence. It was about standing up to bullying behavior that had been affecting our entire community. The neighbors who'd shared their stories that morning after Linda's arrest were just the beginning. As word spread about the impending legal proceedings, more people came forward with their own experiences. The criminal case was straightforward enough. With video evidence, multiple witnesses, and the premeditated nature of the vandalism, proven by her online purchase history for the sledgehammer and cleaning supplies, Linda was facing misdemeanor charges that could result in significant fines and possible jail time. She opted for a plea deal that included community service and mandatory anger management classes, but the civil case, that's where things got truly interesting. The civil proceedings stretched over several weeks, transforming into something far larger than a simple property dispute. Linda's defense strategy seemed to change with each session, as if she was throwing everything at the wall to see what might stick. Her initial argument about historical precedent fell apart when the city planner testified about the shopping center's development history. Her disability access claims crumbled under cross-examination when it was revealed she had no documented mobility issues and was actually a member of an elite CrossFit gym. But it was her attempt to paint me as an antisocial vigilante who was destroying neighborhood cohesion with my fortress mentality that truly backfired. Patricia had prepared for this, and her response was masterful. One by one, she called neighbors to testify about their experiences, not just with Linda's bullying, but with my contributions to the community. Mrs. Chun described how I'd helped her navigate the permit process for her grandson's therapy dog after Linda's complaints. Maria testified about how my garden had inspired her art, and how I'd encouraged her children's interest in native plants. Tom spoke about the neighborhood watch program we'd established together, and how my security cameras had helped solve a series of package thefts last year. The turning point came when Mrs. Chun took the stand for the second time. At 87, she commanded immediate respect from the court, her small frame straight as a ramrod as she faced the judge. She described how she walked to the shopping center 3 times a week using the sidewalk, how I'd installed the bench at her request to give elderly neighbors a resting spot, and how Linda had once berated her for being too slow on the sidewalk. "In my 90 years, Mrs. Chun said firmly, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "I have never met someone so entitled. In my culture, we believe that how you treat your neighbors shows your true character. Mr. Morgan honors our community with his generosity and respect. Mrs. Harrison dishonors herself and our neighborhood with her behavior." Linda's face turned an interesting shade of purple during Mrs. Chen's testimony. Her lawyer, not from her husband's firm, but a younger attorney who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his client, tried to object to the character testimony, but the judge allowed it. "The defendant opened the door to character evidence," he ruled, when she chose to attack the plaintiff's community standing. The judge's ruling was more comprehensive than any of us had anticipated. Judge Michaels, a veteran of the county court system known for his thoughtful opinions, took 2 days to consider all the evidence before delivering his verdict. The courtroom was packed with neighbors when he began speaking, his measured tone giving weight to every word. "This case," he began, adjusting his reading glasses, "while ostensibly about property damage, speaks to deeper issues facing our communities today. Mrs. Harrison's actions demonstrate not just a willful disregard for private property rights, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes neighborhoods thrive. The evidence presented shows a pattern of behavior that undermines the very community bonds she claims to champion." He proceeded to outline the damages. Not only did Linda have to pay for a new section of fence, $3,200 for materials and labor, But she was also ordered to pay $5,000 in punitive damages, cover all legal fees, and take both a property law class and a community relations course at the local community college. The judge's explanation for the educational requirements was particularly pointed. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, looking directly at her, "your repeated citations of legal precedents demonstrate that you understand the language of law, but not its spirit. Your claims about prescriptive easements show that you know enough legal terminology to be dangerous, but not enough to understand why your actions were both legally and morally wrong. Therefore, this court believes that formal education in both property law and community relations would benefit both you and your neighbors." Linda's face, which had been set in its usual mask of indignation, finally cracked. For the first time since this all began, I saw something like uncertainty in her expression. Her lawyer quickly filed an appeal, which was denied within weeks, and the full weight of the judge's ruling began to take effect. But the real changes came after the court case. The neighborhood underwent a subtle but significant transformation, as if Linda's defeat had broken some spell of intimidation. Other neighbors, emboldened by the outcome, began standing up to various forms of bullying and entitlement that had gone unchallenged. The HOA, under Steve's leadership, revised its complaint procedures to prevent abuse of the system. They instituted a 3 strikes policy for frivolous complaints and required mediation before formal grievances could be filed. Maria's kids resumed their basketball games, now joined by other neighborhood children who'd been hesitant to play outdoors. The sound of bouncing balls and children's laughter became a regular part of our evening soundscape again. Steve's pride flag was joined by several others along the street, creating a colorful display that drew positive attention from the local LGBTQ+ community center. Mr. Peterson's bird feeders multiplied, and a local birding group even asked to include his yard in their annual birdwatching tour. Mrs. Chen's grandson Tommy started a dog walking business, inspired by how the community had rallied around him during the therapy dog controversy. Several neighbors, including myself, became his first clients. Every afternoon, you could see him walking a small parade of dogs down the sidewalk, his therapy dog proudly leading the pack. The confidence he gained from this enterprise was remarkable. His mother told me his social anxiety had improved significantly since starting the business. The physical changes to the neighborhood were equally significant. My new section of fence, built with reinforced steel posts and featuring security upgrades suggested by Tom, became something of a local landmark. Other neighbors, inspired by the outcome of my case, began their own property improvements. Maria painted a beautiful mural on her garden wall, properly permitted this time, depicting scenes from the neighborhood's history, including a subtle reference to what we now called the Great Fence Incident. Tom and I started a neighborhood tool-sharing program, complete with a digital lending library and monthly maintenance workshops. It was something we discussed for years but never implemented, partly due to concerns about liability, concerns that now seem trivial compared to what we'd faced with Linda. The program became so successful that neighboring communities began asking for advice on starting their own. Linda's husband sold their house 6 months later and moved to a gated community across town. The irony of this choice wasn't lost on any of us seeking refuge in a community where rules and barriers were even more rigid than anything our neighborhood had ever contemplated. I heard through the grapevine that the incident had been the last straw for their marriage, which had apparently been strained by Linda's behavior for years. Their divorce was finalized shortly after their move. The last time I saw Linda was at the community college where I teach a part-time course on conflict resolution, an opportunity that arose, ironically, because of this incident. She was heading to her court-mandated community relations class, looking somewhat deflated in clothing that, while still expensive, lacked her former aggressive polish. Our eyes met briefly, and she quickly looked away, hurrying past with her textbooks clutched to her chest. I'd like to think I saw a glimmer of self-awareness in that moment, but perhaps that's just my guidance counselor's optimism showing through. The house Linda vacated was bought by a young family, 2 professors, and their adopted daughter. They asked about the neighborhood's history before buying, and we were honest about recent events. Rather than being deterred, they seemed impressed by how the community had handled the situation. "This is exactly the kind of neighborhood we want to live in," they told us. "One that knows how to stand together and stand up for what's right." As for my garden, It flourished that spring like never before. The new section of fence became home to a spectacular climbing rose display, the plants seeming to understand their role in transforming a symbol of conflict into one of beauty. The bench where Mrs. Chun rests during her walks now bears a small plaque dedicated to Sarah's memory, and the garden continues to be a gathering place for neighbors. The incident changed me too, in ways I'm still discovering. Sarah would have handled the situation with more grace, I'm sure, but I like to think she'd be proud of how I managed it. She always said that gardens teach us patience, resilience, and the importance of maintaining healthy boundaries. Lessons that proved surprisingly relevant to community relations. Last week, I overheard one of the neighborhood kids giving their friend a tour of what they still call the Morgan Botanical Gardens. They stopped by the new section of fence, and I heard the young tour guide say, "And this is where Mr. Morgan taught us that you have to stand up to bullies, even when they're grown-ups." The friend asked what happened to the bully, and the guide replied, "She had to learn about being a good neighbor in school, like we do. Except she had to learn it as a grown-up, because she forgot how." The wisdom of children never ceases to amaze me. Standing there, listening to them while pretending to prune my roses, I realized that the whole incident had indeed been an education for all of us. Not just about property rights or legal proceedings, but about the nature of community itself, how it must be actively maintained, like a garden, with both firmness and compassion. Today, our neighborhood is stronger than ever. The incident with Linda, while unpleasant at the time, served as a catalyst for positive change. New traditions have emerged, monthly community potlucks, a thriving community garden program, even a neighborhood dispute resolution committee that helps address conflicts before they escalate. We've learned that the best fences aren't the ones that divide us, but the ones that help us define and maintain healthy boundaries while still allowing for connection and growth. As I write this, I can see Mrs. Chun making her way down the sidewalk toward the shopping center, stopping for her usual rest on Sarah's bench. Tommy passes by with his dog-walking entourage, waving cheerfully. The garden is alive with butterflies. The koi are swimming lazy circles in their pond, and the fence stands solid and whole, protecting not just my property, but a principle that turned out to be worth fighting for. Sometimes, the most important boundaries we maintain aren't the physical ones that mark our property lines, but the moral ones that define our character. Linda's fence-breaking episode taught our neighborhood that lesson in a way none of us will soon forget. And in the end, that might be worth more than all the shortcuts in the world. After all, the longest way round is often the shortest way home, especially when that home is part of a community that knows how to stand together.